We are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us now is economist Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Dean, thanks so much for joining us. And I want to start out by asking you about Janet Yellen. It appears that she was saying that there are some bubbles forming, and you were one of those who saw the housing bubble when it seemed there was sort of collective blindness on that topic in the first decade of this century. She said valuation metrics in some sectors do appear substantially stretched, particularly those for smaller firms in the social media and biotechnology industries. Is she right? Is there a bubble forming there, and is it a significant one?
Well, a couple points. First off, it's important to understand the enormous transformation in thought where a Fed chair sees it as their responsibility to deal with asset bubbles. And I agree with this 100%, but I just go back, 2004, I was actually there. There was a big meeting, the American Economic Association, a convention every year, and there's hundreds and hundreds of sessions, but one of the really big sessions was kind of a tribute to Alan Greenspan, because he was, approaching the end of his tenure as Fed chair, and he's really being celebrated. They had Mervyn King, who was the head of Bank of England, many other very prominent economists up there, all sort of paying tribute to him. And then when Greenspan had a chance to speak, one of his main points was, we know bubbles, no big deal. You just let them run their course, and, they burst, and you pick up the pieces, and he's patting himself on the back because he's going, that's what happened with the stock bubble. Now, that's not my understanding, because it wasn't simple. We actually had, at that time, the longest period without job growth since the Great Depression. So that didn't seem to me a small matter. At that time, it was the longest period. We've now had a longer period, but after the collapse of the housing bubble. But in any case, that was the conventional wisdom, and everyone applauded. They said, oh, what a great man Alan Greenspan is. So the fact that here we are just 10 years later, and the Fed chair today, Janet Yellen, is very clear. We have to deal with asset bubbles. That's a big deal. So I think that's a huge transformation, 100% for the better, because asset bubbles, as we see, can be a very, very big deal and wreak enormous havoc on the economy. So then the question is, okay, so is she doing the right thing? She pointed to the biotech sector, to the social media sector. She also mentioned junk bonds as being overvalued.
Right.
And, I think her points were very well taken. I guess what I'd say a couple things here. One, she made a point of saying that assets in general are not overvalued. So some people have been yelling about the stock market in general being overvalued, and she said no, and I think she's right on that. I look at that closely, and I agree, I concur. It might be high, there's no one, neither she nor I nor anyone else has, a crystal ball that tells them exactly where the stock market should be, but that's not a big deal in the sense, suppose it's 10% too high. I mean, if I had money in the market and it falls 10%, I won't be happy, but that's not going to have any big ramifications for the economy. It's, it's when it's 50% too high, which is, right, what we saw back in the late 90s. So she was right on, saying that. Now, then she picks these particular sectors, social media, biotech, and junk bonds. My assessment is she's probably right on that. She gave evidence, looked at historical comparisons, and I think she had a good basis for that. Now, the one qualification I would say is that these sectors are not that large relative to the economy as a whole, and this is something a point I've often made in terms of, the idea of the Fed chair talking about bubbles. Do you run a risk that, they're like giving financial advice to everyone, and,
right,
you don't expect them to be saying, well, Amazon's a little high, on the other hand, you get a good deal if you buy into Delta. That's not the Fed chair's job. Now, these sectors are larger than that, but if, biotech were to fall 20%, 30%, 40%, that's not a big impact for the economy. Same with the social media. It'll have a big impact on, people of a lot of those stocks, maybe some areas, Silicon Valley may be sufficiently dependent on these. But, for the economy as a whole, probably doesn't matter. My guess is that Yellen was quite consciously experimenting to see how the markets would react, because this is kind of a radical idea. I've been saying it, but I'm used to economists making fun of me for it, that, if the Fed, I don't mean mumbling irrational exuberance, as Greenspan famously did back in 1996. I mean presenting the evidence. Here, these sectors are overvalued. Here's why. Here's the evidence. And I think that would have an impact, and the evidence is to date it did. So I think she may well have been testing that idea.
So it might have been a trial balloon. It's interesting because she limited it to smaller firms in the social media and biotechnology industries. So a number of questions, Dean Baker, on this. One is that, she said valuation metrics in in the sectors she named appear substantially stretched. So you're thinking maybe she's raising the idea that the Fed redefining the Fed chair, and this is almost a sort of first foray into that. I guess, but as to your broader point, where she's saying, and you're agreeing that the stock market isn't hyperinflated, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball either. I just stand back and marvel, and not in a good way necessarily, at a stock market in the 17,000 range when we have such persistent unemployment, underemployment, poor labor force participation, income inequality, wage stagnation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that I just see this. If the stock market isn't overvalued, are we seeing a kind of bifurcation of, or is our economy splitting in two, in effect, where there's a Main Street economy that's so isolated from the Wall Street economy that you can have a not inflated stock market that's so different from the experience of most Americans?
Absolutely. And, again, this is something that, it's painful to me that so many people, including I hear progressives say, they talk about the stock market as though it's an economic measure. It's not. It's not a measure of the economy. It's a measure of corporate profitability. And corporate profits are very good, look like they'll be very good, or high, I guess I should say, and not use the term good, but they're high, they're likely to be high for the foreseeable future, and that's determining stock market valuations. So when someone says, Obama's done a great job, the stock market's doubled under his reign. Now, in fairness, it had fallen in half before he took office, so you have to qualify that a little bit. But in any case, that's not telling you Obama did a good job. What that's saying is that Obama did good for people who own stock, which, is fine, but we want to see that he's doing well for the country as a whole, and that those are the measures that most of us care about: wage growth, job growth, people getting health care benefits. That's where most people live. So the stock market's not telling you the economy's good or bad. It's just telling you corporate profits are high, and that's true.
So, but traditional, look, I mean, as I perceive it, and as I think a number of people perceive it, historically, though, that your point well taken, it's clearly just an index of corporate profitability, but there used to be, it seems to me, more of a gravitational pull between corporate profits and everyday economic experiences than there is now. I mean, I think, 40% or whatever it is of corporate profits now coming from the financial sector, which is disconnected from whether people have or don't have jobs, and, the decline in manufacturing, globalization, whatever it is. It seems now, at least 40 years ago, if the stock market was up, it seemed like there was a reasonably good chance that people were doing better in their daily lives as well. Now it seems like there's a complete disconnect.
Yeah, we could talk about this idea of a virtuous circle where, I'm thinking the 40s, 50s, 60s, at least into the early 70s, where higher productivity translated into higher wage growth. That meant more demand. That increased corporate profits. Companies would then reinvest, leading to, further gains in productivity growth, further gains in wages, on and on. So that was sort of this virtuous cycle. So, companies gained, they got higher profits, but then that went back to workers because they would, invest in technology that improved productivity, which would lead to higher wages. That's long gone. So now you see corporate profits go up. Companies might pay it out in dividends, share buybacks. They might invest overseas. There's not a very direct link at all these days between corporate profits and their investment, at least their investment in the United States. So that's clearly been broken for a while, and certainly very much broken in this recovery, where we've seen very sharp uptick in corporate profits, getting back above, in fact, the pre-recession level, but investment nowhere keeping pace with that.
Well, I got a hypothetical for you then. If we were, and it's highly hypothetical, if we were to restore, if we had a new government come in, and a new Congress, and a new everything, committed to restoring that virtuous circle, committing to reintegrating these segments of the economy, at that, you're going to say probably you hate the question or it's a stupid question, but at that point, would the stock market overall be overvalued?
I don't think so, because the flip side of this is that you might see some fall in profit shares, but keep in mind, we're somewhere around 6% below full employment. In other words, our economy could produce about 6% more than it actually is. So let's say we saw somewhat of a fall in the share of income going to profits, but at the same time, income rose by somewhere in the order of, let's just say, 6%. Now, the net might be a small negative for profits, but I don't think it would be a very large one. So I don't think we have to worry that if, we get, I think what you and I and many others would hope for, that we see a situation where workers are again getting their fair share of economic growth, that corporate profits will plummet. They might go down a little. I'm not going to guarantee they won't fall at all, but, I don't see a story where they collapse.
And there might be a shift in profit from one sector to another here and there. You might, right? I mean, you might.
Yeah,
see...
well, one of the things I certainly would hope for is a big shift away from finance. That we're seeing a lot of profit earned by banks that or financial firms that are basically shuffling money. That it's not doing anything productive for the economy. So my hope would be their profits would go down quite a bit, and a lot of those companies would go out of business.
And one of your big issues, I know, and you've done a lot of research and thinking and advocacy on this, is the fact that for 30 years at least we had wages tied to productivity in this country, and then that was severed also as, I guess, part of this disconnect of the virtuous circle. If we were able to restore that relationship again, so that wages had a closer relationship to productivity, same thing. I mean, corporate profits wouldn't be hurt that badly. There might be some shift, or would that be a significant shift for the corporate world?
Well, again, what you would expect, or at least what I would expect, what I'd hope for, is that we see a story where the economy gets, we see some downward shift in corporate profits in their shares, and then we're on a path where, let's say, the economy is growing 2.5–3% a year. Profits are growing 2.5–3% a year, as are wages. Somewhere in that ballpark. So you end up with a situation where profits could still grow, but they're growing in line with the economy, in line with productivity, not growing at the expense of wages.
So I had a sort of master. I was leading somewhere with all of this. Dean Baker, Center for Economic Policy Research, which is getting back to the Fed, circling back to the Fed now. So you've been a strong advocate on this issue this week. Lawrence Katz from Harvard and EPI's Josh Bivens were getting on the issue of what the Fed ought to do, pointing out that there's, I guess, what you and I have talked about before, kind of premature celebration of the idea that the economy, quote unquote, is restored and that unemployment is getting into reasonable levels, when in fact that's just going off the employment rate is the base unemployment rate is not enough, and we're seeing significant. How do we make sure that the Fed and policymakers in general stay focused on unemployment and underemployment, and B, strengthening wages, obviously two interconnected problems? How do we make sure that we don't get too contented too early, whether we're talking about the Fed's Open Market Committee or policymakers in Washington?
Well, this is something that gets complicated, because the Fed, ostensibly they try to separate it from politics, so it's difficult, insulate from politics, so it's difficult for members of Congress to directly influence the Fed. But by taking away influence from Congress, basically they substitute influence from the financial sector, which is obviously pernicious in the sense that the financial sector's interests are generally not closely aligned with those of the typical worker. So how do you affect that? Well, one, members of Congress should take responsibility. They do talk to the Fed chair. Janet Yellen does testify at least twice a year. In fact, she's generally testifying before committees more than that. And, she should be pressed. I have a lot of confidence in her. I think she's a very good Fed chair, but like anyone else, she's going to respond to pressure. And if it's all coming from the side, the financial sector saying, oh, you got to do something about inflation, she's going to feel that, and she needs people, progressives saying, look, keep your foot on the accelerator. We got to get the unemployment down. So members of Congress, that's a really important point. The other part of the story, and this is where the Fed really gets convoluted, you have the 12 regional Fed banks. They're spread around the country. There's one here in Richmond. There's one, New York, of course, has the biggest, most important one in Philadelphia, St. Louis. I mean, so they're spread around the country. Those people, in principle, also could be pressured. I mean, people should find out who their Fed bank president is, send them letters, send the board members, the local feds, the regional feds, I should say, letters, let them know people are watching, because as it stands now, those Fed, they all sit there. All 12 of those people sit on the open market committee. At any point in time, only 5 have a vote, but all 12 are sitting there. And the people they're answering most directly to are the banks in the district. Now, in principle, they're supposed to be representing all of us. So it's important that they know people are watching. And if they're going to say raise rates, meaning slow the economy, throw people out of work, they have to know we don't like that. Their bankers might be fine with it, but they have to know they're supposed to represent the whole country. Is it, the kind of a fluke? You may not want to say a fluke. It was obviously planned, but in any case, because of a quirk in the system, they were able to set it up so that the bankers actually control who gets sent there. But again, they can't. At least they'll have a hard time saying publicly, "Well, screw you. The banks who put me here want low inflation." So we have to let them know people are watching.
Well, I think that's a great idea. I love the idea of taking the debate to the local feds. And of course, they're a diverse group. It seems to me that, for example, Richard Fisher, who I believe is the president of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank, is a good guy with a lot of good ideas, and others less so. But am I right about, isn't it Fisher who's come up with some...
Well, they're very mixed. What you find is Richard Fisher's been very good on regulatory issues. He wants to break up the large banks, and that I certainly applaud and very much sympathize with. On the other hand, on inflation, he's a real hawk. So he's constantly on the guard saying, "Oh my God, we got to worry about inflation. We got to worry about inflation." Thomas Honig, he's now the vice chair of the FDIC, but for years he was the president of the Kansas City Bank. It was the same thing. He was great on banking regulation. He considered the too big to fail banks, a real failure of the capitalist system, because basically they're getting a subsidy from the government, because everyone knows the government will bail them out. So he was very good on banking regulation, but he too was very much an inflation hawk. So he's always looking for inflation. It's under the bed, this and that. So, you find people are like that, and, I think they're both honest people. I think those are their real convictions. But, again, they have to be pressured on this inflation issue and, really come to grips. They'd been warning about inflation for years, and it's just not there. So it's not like this is a subjective thing that, I like inflation, you like vanilla ice cream or something. This is, there can be threats of inflation. We've seen cases where there's serious inflation, but it's not there now, and it's not likely to be there anytime in the near future, given what we know about the economy.
Yeah, and it seems to me that that's just an analytical challenge, that they've been saying if A, then B, and we've had A without B. So but anyway, okay, that's a conversation for another day. I like where this wound up, which is basically think globally and act locally when you're looking at the Federal Reserve and what it might want to do. So once again, as always, thanks so much for joining us, Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
You bet. I am RJ Eskow. We will be back after this. This is The Zero Hour.